Diabetes in Hazelhurst Hospital, which is an EASO Centre of Obesity Management.
Excuse me, could you speak a little bit slower?
Oh, sorry, yes.
I'll move your mic.
Let's try again. Yeah, sorry, you're quite right. And I had that in my head as well, because obviously lots of people here of different languages, so I'll try my best to slow down. If I do start talking quickly again, if somebody could just shout at me, it will be very well received and it'll be fine. Okay. So as I say, my name's John. I'm a clinical lecturer in endocrinology and diabetes. I work at the Centre of Obesity Management, which is at Hazelhurst Hospital in Birmingham, and I'm also an academic at the University of Birmingham. And I'm really pleased to be here today and to kind of support this group and ECPO in particular and all the great work that it does. It's really nice to be here. And actually the introduction I think was key. We've heard lots already about what the idea today is to share. And I don't feel I'm here to teach, I also feel I'm very much here to learn. That said, I am obviously going to cover a lot of information today, hopefully in a slightly clearer way than you might have heard before. So lots of people in this audience are fairly expert, and I've met lots of people in this audience before at different meetings. And I know that you'll have heard some of these kind of talks before, or at least some people will have done. But I also know that there will be other people who haven't heard this kind of talk before. And I'm going to try and make this as clear about the message that I'm going to try and convey as I possibly can. I would be wearing my People First ribbon, but I haven't got anything to stick it to. But pleased to have that on my initial slide. So I don't really have any significant disclosures. Some of my professional training is supported by Novo Nordisk, but I haven't had any money off them for kind of speaking engagements or anything like that. I invite you to ask me lots of questions. If there is anything I say that isn't clear, or I'm speaking too quickly, then please shout at me, that's fine. I will ensure that I use people first language and non-stigmatizing images throughout the presentation. If I say something that is not people first, accidentally, when I'm talking about data, I invite you all to tell me and to shout at me, and that will be very well received, so don't worry about that, but I'd be surprised if it happens. So I guess the framework of the talk today is about obesity as a disease. And of course, obesity is a disease, and I'm going to cover why that is in the coming time. And we've got quite a long slot, so there's plenty of time for discussion as we go. I have obviously written a presentation to be the kind of framework for this session, but do feel free to ask me questions as we go. That's not a problem, there's plenty of time for that. But as part of thinking about obesity as a disease, and to help as part of this event and this kind of empowerment training, I'm going to try and provide some responses to why some people say that obesity isn't a disease. Now, just to be very clear, that's not my position, and that's not my outlook, and that's not represented by the centre I work in or my colleagues, but it's my job to try and provide you all, I hope, what my brief is, some answers to what some people say. Okay, and that's how I'm going to frame the talk. Now, this is obviously a very mixed audience. I imagine there'll be people from every profession in this audience and every walk of life, because that's the nature of obesity. Obviously, some of you will understand scientific data very rigorously, some of you will be slightly unfamiliar. And I'm going to try and kind of walk you through some of the data that I'm going to show in a fairly accessible manner. Okay? And as I say, if there are anyone's unsure, please do tell me. Okay? What the slides are mostly going to look like, and this might seem like a strange thing to do, but just to kind of prepare you all for what you're about to see, is you're going to see quite a bit of data. That might be some graphs, it might be some diagrams, all sorts of things. In a yellow box, you're going to see the kind of design of that study. So I think some of what we kind of in the obesity community get criticised is people say, oh, that study was only done in however many people, or it's not relevant to a wider population. So all the research I'm going to talk about, I'm going to try and explain who that was applicable to, you know, and why it matters to certain populations. And then in the red, you'll see some hopefully very clear take-home messages, which I hope are very consistent. And then when all you see these academic talks, the bottom little bit in the black that's always tiny and too hard to see, is the people that did the work that I'm going to talk about. And actually all the science that I'm going to talk about today, and all of the data that I'm going to talk about today, is all, I think over 90% of this is freely accessible information. You don't need to pay any subscriptions to any academic journals, or there's no paywalls about what I'm going to kind of tell you. You know, so if you want to go away and do further reading around anything I talk about today, everybody in this room has access to that information, okay? So, you know, I don't want you all to necessarily agree with everything I say. I want you to think carefully about what I have to say, okay? And if you don't agree with me, that's absolutely fine, and I kind of welcome that discussion. Equally today, I might say some things that resonate with some people, okay? Because I'm obviously going to present the kind of wider data. And if something resonates with you, or you find it upsetting or distressing, that's obviously not my intention, then we can obviously talk about that as the day progresses. So, as with all talks, lots of aims. What's obesity? And that's going to sound like a very strange thing to this audience, but it's actually hugely important in the classification of obesity as a disease. Does medically or perhaps metabolically healthy obesity exist? That's another really important area, thinking about obesity as a disease. How common is obesity? What causes obesity? What are the consequences of obesity? And that will be in the framework all of, is obesity as a disease? A little bit around some interventions. I'll have a bit of a focus on whether diet is effective. Okay. I'll talk a little bit about some medications, and I will obviously talk a little bit about bariatric surgery, and I will also cover some of the data and science around stigma as well. So, always good to start at the end with some conclusions in case everybody decides to fall asleep, and that's fine. It is an early start after all. Now, obesity has clearly got a major adverse impact at people at an individual level, the healthcare system, and also to an extent the economy as well. Preventing and treating obesity is a public health priority. And you'll see there that I said and treating. This can't be either or. We mustn't focus all our efforts on prevention or all on treatment. It has to be a kind of a joined up strategy. There are obviously some things that are aimed at prevention that might benefit people undergoing or seeking treatment as a kind of follow-on, but we must think about these things joined up but slightly separately as well. Now, obesity is, I'm going to show you lots of data shortly, is obviously a multifactorial chronic relapsing disease, and that word relapsing is key. And it's caused by complex genetic, environmental and biological interactions. And if anyone doesn't believe me, I'll be convincing you of all of that shortly. And it's not caused by, clearly, a lack of willpower. Now, weight regain, which is an extremely difficult area, and you've heard about some of the studies already from EASO, is driven by biology. Okay? It's extremely difficult, and I'll explain why that is shortly, and it's not related to willpower. Recognising obesity as a disease caused by a combination of genetic predisposition, as well as some what we call modifiable risk factors, so things that we can try and change to an extent, can lead to policies addressing the obesogenic environment, as well as increasing access to treatment. So, okay, so what is obesity? And that feels like a strange question. But actually, this is crucial because it's answering the question, how can obesity be a disease when we don't always know what it is? Okay? And I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. So this is the World Health Organization definition of obesity. And here you can see that it says, overweight and obesity are defined as abnormal, their word, not mine, or excessive fat accumulation that presents a risk to health. Now this is the opening bit of their definition, there's more to come. There's a few things in this that are very positive, and there's a few things in this that are not so positive. The fact that it identifies fat or adipose tissue accumulation as being central, rather than body mass index, is a real strength of this opening definition, and I'll explain why that is in a moment. And the association with a risk to health is important, although I don't find the word abnormal to be that helpful, and obviously defining excessive is extremely difficult as well, and that's why the WHO's definition goes on perhaps predictably to talk about body mass index. And it says that it's a crude population measure of obesity. It's the body mass index, and as we all know, that's a person's weight in kilograms divided by their height in meters squared. And they say that a person with a BMI of 30 or more is generally considered obese, and the person, and obviously that should really change now to have obesity, but this is fairly, I guess this is slightly out of date, this definition. I'm sure that will be revised by the WHO. And a person with a BMI or equal to more than 25 is considered to have overweight. Okay. Now there are clearly ethnicity differences in BMI classification, and to be fair to the WHO, they accept that body mass index is a crude population tool, and it clearly doesn't apply to every individual, and we'll see why that might be shortly. So when we think about body mass index, it is useful at a population level, and I'll show you some convincing data about why that is, but it doesn't necessarily tell you a lot about the person that you are or that you're talking to in clinic. It tells you about a big group of people and the risk of certain things happening at a kind of whole population level. And this is some data, so a few years old now, done in America, and it compares percentage body fat to body mass index. And all the data that I'm going to show you today is going to be about adults, unless I explicitly say this is about children. Okay, so everything you're going to hear is mostly about adults, because that's my particular expertise. And you can see that BMI is along the bottom, and body fat percentage is along the top, and it's separated by gender and age. And there does look to be what we call a correlation, so this line is fairly straight, and that tells us that as BMI goes up mostly, percentage body fat goes up. Well, that's kind of fair enough. That's what we would hope to see if BMI is perhaps useful. And then once we just start to kind of overlay some lines, and there's two red lines here. One is at that magical BMI of 30, and the other is overlaid at a body fat percentage of 25. And look at all of these people that you can all of a sudden misclassify, and each of these little blue dots represents a person. Okay? So all of the people down here by BMI have been told that they have obesity, but actually look, lots of them got a very low percentage body fat, so what's actually that person's real metabolic risk? Whereas the people up in the top left who've got a normal body mass index have actually got a significantly elevated percentage body fat. So there's an enormous amount of misclassification at an individual level with BMI. That said, I've said it's not great at an individual level. There is important data at a population level. And this is an enormous, what we call a registry study, so it's kind of population numbers. So in the top panels, this is 3.6 million adults. Bottom panel is 2 million adults who have never smoked. And this is what we call, these are mortality risks, and the red lines represent a body mass index of 30. And you can see here that at a population level, there is an increased risk of mortality beyond the body mass index of 30 at a population level. So it doesn't necessarily tell you about the person in front of you, but as an entire country or Europe or the world, that's kind of informative data, and it's separated by different causes of mortality. We'll see that slide again soon. But actually, how relevant is that to people? And I would suggest not very. So some of you will already be familiar with the Edmonton obesity staging system or scoring system, and I'm going to explain that in more detail shortly. But you can see here, this is the historical classification of obesity by the WHO, by BMI criteria, class 1 obesity, historically term, body mass index of 30 to 35, class 2, 35 to 40, class 3, body mass index of more than 40. And this is a survival graph. So if everybody in this study, I haven't put the numbers on here, but big numbers from a massive American study, prospectively followed up. If everybody survived in this study, that line at the top will just go straight across along the number 1. Okay? So unfortunately, as this line falls, that actually represents, you know, people dying. And you can see here that different classes of obesity, there's no separation whatsoever of the data, is there? And this is the BMI data over here. So this is complete overlap. Yep. So actually the BMI classification on this population had no impact really. And you can see that, I think, fairly clearly there. On the other hand, on the Edmonton score, and I'm going to come back to exactly what that is soon, when we look to think more about the person in front of us, and the, oh, yes please.
Do you, for the right hand graph, do you have the survival data for normal weight people?
Yeah, it's obviously that obviously is available, but not within that paper.
Okay.
So that was just separated out. That was a study of people living with obesity.
Yeah.
So not available.
So
yeah. So that would be really important, because actually what we'd like to see is there a separation at all on this? Yeah. No, that isn't in that paper.
Okay.
It's a really important question actually. And then on the Edmonton obesity staging system, so black line is 0, and I'll explain what that is in a minute. Red line is 1, green is 2, blue is 3. That will all become clear what that means shortly. You can see that there's a big separation about survival. So there's a big difference. That's far more, I would argue, that's far more informative than body mass index.
So
yes, please.
again, the left slide only includes people with BMI over 25.
It only includes people with a BMI of more than, I think slightly higher than 25 actually. For
yeah. So no people with normal BMI.
Correct.
Would be very interesting
Correct.
to have
it would
those.
Be nice, it would be nice to have that on that graph to see the differences. Although we know from some of the very large studies, one of which I've briefly mentioned, some more are going to come shortly, that there is a separation based on body mass index, which we're going to come on to.
Yes.
And we know of the separation from body mass index, and I've told you that the EOSS score separates even further. So it's a fairly powerful tool.
Yeah, but I would love to see how the EOS stage 0 compares with
Yes.
no BMI,
yeah,
with
absolutely.
normal BMI.
And I think that's a crucial question when we're thinking about obesity as a disease. And we're going to come on to some data around metabolically healthy obesity in a second, which I think will in part answer some of your kind of thoughts and queries.
Thank you.
Why is BMI more common and more used than EOS?
Because it's extremely easy and cheap to do, and it requires no time at all.
I don't agree, because it's a thing from insurance companies only.
Yeah. So the origin, as you say, Carlos, is the origin of body mass index was a Belgian mathematician many years ago who was looking to design a population tool for an insurance company.
Sorry, I'm from Belgium, and I'm a statistician. I know this was designed for nothing to do with insurance companies at all.
The Quadlet index?
Quadlet index was designed on young soldiers in the army.
Yeah.
Had nothing to do with insurance.
So what was the origin then? Where's that myth come from?
Huh?
Where's the myth come from?
The classification was made in the United States using the Kittler index.
Mm.
But so the Kittler index was actually made as something to to describe how fat the recruits were.
Mm-hmm.
In one number,
Yeah.
but nothing to do with survival.
Yes, yeah. There clearly must be a lot of myths and counter information out there, because I think that's probably something we've all heard many times before, and it sounds like a couple of us have certainly read about it. So that's part of being here today, isn't it, to dispel some of the myths.
And I mean,
sides.
it was made in the early 19th century.
Yeah.
There was nothing going on with overweight and obesity then. I don't even know whether there were insurance companies then.
Dominique has a question?
Mm.
Yes, maybe we use BMI because it's known since really a very long time. It's very easy. EOSS is really far more recent, and it's more difficult because you have to stage
Correct.
the psychological aspects,
Correct.
physical aspects,
Correct. Yeah.
everything before making the stage. So it's
Yeah.
maybe
You're absolutely right. And after all, for BMI, all we need is a height and weight. Okay. And for EOSS, we actually need to have a proper detailed assessment and a conversation of that person living with obesity. And I'm hopefully going to argue that that's crucial to kind of treatment strategies and aims. So other criticisms of BMI are that it is a useful population tool. I've said that it might be less applicable to an individual's risk. There obviously doesn't take into account body fat distribution or differences in muscle versus adipose in terms, so there's no correction for lean mass rather than adipose tissue mass. But actually in many centres, it's all we have potentially. There are other ways to assess adiposity or obesity, for example, measures of body composition like DEXA, but the downside of that is it incorporates a small exposure to radiation, which is obviously something best avoided if it's not necessary. But there is some data about waist-hip ratio, and I'm going to come on to that at the moment, and as to why that might be relevant, particularly when we start to unpick metabolically healthy obesity. So this is from the same American cohort, around about 15,000 adults. And actually this is quite interesting because this is the beginning of what I'm going to talk to you about with the metabolically healthy obesity paradox and what that means, and I'm going to explain that clearly in a second. But you can see here, this is some mathematical modelling, but if you can imagine a person with a body mass index of 33, but a comparatively lower waist-hip ratio, and then up here in that red circle, there's somebody with a body mass index of 22, but a higher waist-to-hip ratio. And then if you compare the mortality risk of these two groups, very interestingly, the mortality risk was greater for the person up here. Well, this is a model, but for the example person up here with a normal body mass index, but increased waist-hip ratio. So that starts to speak to me about the distribution of adipose tissue and metabolic risk. When I kind of speak to people in clinic, who's more at risk of subsequent complications, assuming there aren't any to begin with, somebody who has a body mass index of 40, who's perhaps very active, very muscular, their adipose tissue is distributed evenly, somebody with a body mass index of the same, 40, but actually they're less muscular and their adipose tissue is all accumulated centro-abdominally, what we know increased risk is. So in this study at least, normal weight central obesity, defined here by waist-to-hip ratio, was actually associated with a bigger mortality risk than BMI-defined obesity. So we really do need to look a little bit beyond BMI and think about people at an individual level. And that's really part of the key message of this data. We do need to talk about metabolically healthy obesity and whether that exists. And that's a very contentious area. And actually at ECO this year, I guess some of us were there, and there were some fairly heated debates from the audience. There are some fairly strong believers in metabolically healthy obesity, I think it's fair to say. And there are some fairly strong deniers as well. And I don't think I'm going to necessarily be able to solve that today, but I am going to tell you what underlies what I think and my interpretation of the data, and I invite you to think about what it might mean to you, or to perhaps to people you know, and come to your own conclusions. And really this is designed to answer the question that people pose, which is, well, some people with obesity are really fit, okay? And that's obviously true, there's no discussion about that. So how can it be a disease? Okay, and that's the question that underlies what I'm going to talk about in a moment. And the central theme for this is what's known as the obesity paradox, and whether or not that this is true. And for people that aren't familiar with the obesity paradox, and it is a bit strange, I've just cribbed a definition from a paper. And what it says is that it appears that some people with a body mass index in the obese or overweight range have got better short and long-term health outcomes than those with a normal body mass index. Okay? And that might relate to some of the data I just showed you about where we perhaps carry our adipose tissue, perhaps. Research suggests that the obesity paradox might be in part due to physical fitness, and there's quite a lot of debate about that, and physical activity. Now, in my opinion, I think when we think about metabolically healthy obesity as a paradox, I think the key to this paradox is how we define obesity. Okay? Because lots of the studies that examine metabolically healthy obesity are so BMI reliant, and I've told you that that might not necessarily be the best measure of adiposity in an individual, I personally question the idea of metabolically healthy obesity, and I'm going to show you some data in a second that you can also think about. So this is what we call a systematic review. So some of you might be familiar with systematic reviews. It's where the researchers analyse data from lots of other, well, in this case not actually that many, but from other research studies and analyse them together. Okay? And this is a comparison of people with metabolically healthy obesity, just over 4,000 people in the total pooled analysis, and people who were metabolically healthy but defined as having a normal weight. And this is a comparison with more than 10 years of follow-up of these two different groups. And I think it's important to see here, and this is all-cause mortality, including cardiovascular events. And you can see here, so the dotted line represents kind of no change at all. And as we move this way, and this is what we call, this is the summary statistic here. Some of you might be familiar with that, but because it separates this way, it shows us that there's an increased risk in these people who are defined as having metabolically healthy obesity. And actually, clearly that's been studied a lot. Here's another study, this time this is a UK GP registry database study, and I think the average follow-up in this study was between 4 and 7 years, that kind of time frame. More than 120,000 people defined as having metabolically healthy obesity. So that was defined in the study as a raised body mass index, but without any complications present in terms of diabetes, blood pressure, dyslipidemia. I think sleep apnea was included in this study too. And in this graph, if the line just went straight across, that would mean that everybody was staying healthy. Okay, so this isn't about survival or mortality. This is about So this is about, if it just goes straight across the green line, that would be about staying healthy. If it goes down, that's about becoming unhealthy. Okay, and you can see that lots of these people who were defined as having metabolically healthy obesity at the onset of this study developed metabolically unhealthy obesity with follow-up. And another study, this time an even bigger cohort of people, again a registry study, and this time it's 3.5 million adults in total, so this is a pretty large study of people defined as having metabolically healthy obesity. And the figure I've circled shows the 96% increased risk of heart failure across the follow-up interval of this kind of patient group. So what lots of us believe from our interpretation of the data, and feel free to disagree with me, is that metabolically healthy obesity is a risk factor for all-cause mortality and for cardiovascular disease. And I think at least in some, it might only be a temporary state of health. And I do firmly believe that that's what the data shows. There are always people that will disagree with me about that, and there will be individuals who live with obesity who obviously do not develop any consequences or complications, and obviously we very much want that to happen. But I think on the kind of large data sets and the data that we have available, I do think that's what the data shows. So the next question I look to answer is how common is obesity? And this is really to answer the question, well look, 650 million people in the world surely don't have a disease. And that's obviously something that people say. My kind of immediate thought to that was this 2015 study, which showed that 422 million people in the world have got cardiovascular disease. It's important to note, though, in that study that cardiovascular disease was it was classified as a composition of various cardiovascular diseases, and it does slightly artificially inflate that figure. But whatever we think, the status quo of saying obesity isn't a disease isn't working. Okay, so something fundamentally has to change. And how common is obesity globally? This is reasonably recent data from the WHO, and dark blue means that obesity is more common in those countries. And you can see that obesity is common throughout the world. Obviously, there is some protection for areas in the world of significant and extreme poverty. Although some of the data that I'm not going to show today actually shows that some of the increased prevalence in obesity that we're seeing, so obesity being more common, is actually being driven by rises in rates of rural obesity rather than in urban obesity. And that's quite interesting data, but I'm not going to touch on that today. This is data from fairly developed countries, from the kind of OECD data, and some of you in the room might be from, yes please? Here we go. Question? Oh, sorry, I think I had a question. And some of you might be from some of the countries listed here. And on the left-hand panel, the light colours are that's self-reported data. So that's perhaps less reliable than some of the darker bars where we've got direct measurement data. And on the right, it's divided by gender. No big separations in these very developed countries by gender, male and female differences. But actually, in the world at large, there's some very significant separations. So in some countries, obesity will be far more common in men. In other countries, it will be more common in women. And some of these countries are actually in very close geographical proximity, which is very interesting and not at all understood. That's why I'm going to stay away from it today. And when we think about obesity and obesity prevalence, we've got to think about what's happening over time. So this panel is from 1975, and it's not ideal because it actually shows the average BMI of the underlying areas rather than the prevalence of obesity, so, which is perhaps not a great assessment, but this was the data that was available. And then on the right, it's the 2014 average BMI. And this is data from 20 million, or near enough 20 million adults in 186 countries of the 200 countries that they tried to get the data from. So this is fairly significant and shows that the situation is clearly changing. So the current status, yes please.
Hi. So my big question and the struggle that I have, Jack and Bowman, I'm based in Brussels, making policy on obesity. And one of the big struggles that we're having, which Abs actually outlined in the ARV session at the Davos for Public Health a few weeks ago, is that there's a big difference between saying obesity is a disease, but not what sort of disease. So a chronic relapsing disease, which is what ECPO is absolutely advocating, as is ARZO and others within the community. So all that you're saying, love it, you're absolutely fantastic, and I'm going to go into that tomorrow in my session with Drew. But, oh sorry, too fast. But my big question is, how do you translate scientifically all of the data and evidence explanation into saying up front, this is a chronic relapsing disease, because that is the big issue that we're facing, certainly on a policy level.
Yeah. I'm going to come to the relapsing component shortly.
Okay.
Don't worry. I think I'll be answering that question subsequently.
Right.
But if I don't, then just kind of tell me again, or at least trying to, because I don't think there is actually a clear answer. Oh, there's a slide miss. No. Yeah. So when we think about obesity, and I told you that obesity prevalence is rising, let's just have a quick look at bariatric surgery, and this is surgery registry data from 2015. I'm sure there's a missing. Oh, one of my slides seems to disappear, but not to worry. So the dots, the black dots represent the number of bariatric surgeries performed per million of the population. Okay. and the kind of shaded columns represent the number of surgeries in total performed annually. Okay? So you'll see that some countries with a slightly smaller population are actually doing a lot of bariatric surgery per 1 million population. For example, in 2015 data identified Belgium as a country that does a lot of surgery relative to the size of the population. And unfortunately, the slide that's disappeared is about the prevalence of obesity in each country, because you can see here, where in the United Kingdom, well actually in England, this data here, there's actually not much bariatric surgery per million of the population, but the prevalence of obesity is higher in England than it is certainly than it is in Belgium, and it is in France as well. So it looks to me that there's a bit of a mismatch between areas where obesity prevalence is high and the delivery of perhaps the most effective treatment for obesity. Yes, please.
Excusez-moi, donc je France.
Yeah, I'm going to translate.
Les chiffres sont importants parce qu'on a un système de santé qui le permet.
The statistics, the numbers are important because we have a health system that allows us to.
Et c'est ce qui donne en fait tout l'attrait à la France, c'est que les Français peuvent se soigner à n'importe quel moment avec ce système de santé.
Okay, for example, in France, it works because in France we can use the system to treat ourselves whenever,
Ce qui n'est pas le cas dans les autres pays.
which is not the case in other countries. So it's about basically access.
Access.
Yeah, because in France and Belgium you can just go straight, whereas in other systems, so like the UK for instance, it can take up to 3-4 years to actually get a referral. So that will reflect on.
So this is direct access, what you're telling me, to the healthcare system.
To different parts of it, yeah. So say I know the Belgian system really well. I'm Jitchi level. I know the Belgian system very well, and basically once people have made that decision to be treated, we don't need to do all of the prevention stuff. It's a different budget, different part of the system. We can go straight to surgery.
And how long does that pathway pre-surgery take from someone that's perhaps seeking surgery or wants surgery?
In my particular case, I could have had surgery within 2 weeks. Yeah. I chose to make it take 6 months and did my research, but it could have taken me, we'll talk afterwards. It could have taken me 2 weeks.
Yeah, it's very interesting because in the UK we obviously have this tier 3 medical weight management system prior to bariatric surgery, and there's no data that our tier 3 weight management system is effective or helpful or predicts outcomes in people undergoing bariatric surgery. And I'm very happy to say that because I've looked at our own data. In the UK, we have a slightly artificial barrier that applies to most of the people seeking treatment, where people have to go through this period of time, pathway, assessment, intervention prior to surgery. That's not always a very good idea, and sometimes it's very bad. In certain centres in Scotland, and there are Scottish representatives present who might tell me differently, but I know from some of the Scottish data that some people in Scotland who are seeking bariatric surgery are expected to lose a certain percentage of their body weight before they actually have surgery. And there's no data whatsoever that that's useful, helpful, or predicts outcomes. So we don't have that in England currently, in the overwhelming number of centres, but we don't have that access sooner. I am going to talk about bariatric surgery shortly, but I do think some sort of pre-assessment process before such a significant thing as bariatric surgery is important, and I'm sure that does happen in France and Belgium, but it sounds like it's a shorter time pathway, and that's got to be a good thing.
Actually, it's not on paper. It can be long, but the reality is in Belgium, depending on where you live, it's the Belgian way of let's find a solution. So you can run through, depending depending on where you are and what your relationship is, how well you can walk through the system. So it should really take 6 months, but in my case, I could have done 2 weeks because of where I happen to live.
To get back from some local situations to the chart itself. The chart tells us something about the difference between the health system, but nothing about the risk prevalence, etc. So that might be the missing chart. If you look at the total numbers of severely obese people and compare to those numbers, it's a very small percentage where every country is.
That's actually the slide that somehow disappeared. Yeah, because you're quite right. And unfortunately what that slide shows is that the more common obesity in that country, the less surgery that happens. And I hope no more of my other slides have disappeared. I'm not quite sure why that is, but you're quite right, because that's the crucial point. And I'm really heartened to hear some examples from other European countries and partners with shorter pre-op intervention pathways. And in our own centre in Heartlands Hospital in Birmingham, we are now bringing in a new 3-month pathway, but that's particularly aimed at people with established type 2 diabetes, so it won't necessarily be for everybody. But we are trying to improve our own pathways and speed for patients where we can, because it's extremely important. Okay. But when we think about what causes obesity, and there's obviously lots of genetic determinants, and this is an answer to the question that I don't believe, and I'd probably rather people didn't take photos of this question because you don't believe it. Well, surely it's just caused by eating too much. Okay, and we've all heard that. Okay, and actually I have patients in my own clinic who tell me that, which is interesting in itself. And you know, some people here will be involved in Action.io. I'm not, and I'll hopefully have time to show some of that data, although it may be being talked about later in the weekend. So I'm also going to talk about genetics and biology and a few other things as well. And this is that diagram that always gets shown in all of these talks from the Foresight report in 2007, where the speaker seeks to bamboozle people, as far as I can tell. And I think this is quite bamboozling, actually, even when it's subgrouped like this. And what this is a systems mapping approach generated by 300 experts from different organisations, including some people living with obesity and experts across different fields that are related to obesity, to try and think about some of the causes and contributors to obesity. So when people show you this, that's the origin of it. So people can put that in a bit more of a context. And you'll note that nowhere on that slide does it say lack of willpower anywhere on that, because clearly that's not relevant. Yep.
How big do you need to print that to be able to weight?
Exactly. And that's why I said from the outset that I think this slide is sometimes used to confuse and bamboozle. So that's why I've included it today, to try and demystify the origin of that, because it's kind of always...
No, but I actually want to know, if I want to weight the individual things, how big do I need to print
Oh,
it?
A1.
A1?
A1, you'd be able to read it. Yeah. That's not that big. And at the centre of that process, although you can't see, is appetite regulation within the brain. And I'm going to talk about why that's overwhelmingly genetically driven. And within that panel that I've showed you before, this time classified slightly differently and grouped differently, but ostensibly the same diagram, there's lots of different drivers to dietary habits and energy intake, and lots of different contributors as well to energy expenditure. So we also need to think about genetics as a major driver to obesity. And this is a study of 340,000 adults, mostly of European origin. And this is what we call a genome-wide association study. So this is a study that looks for lots of very tiny changes within the genetic material. And it doesn't necessarily tell us about the gene involved, but it tells us about the location of that change. That's what these kind of studies tell us when we talk about gene loss or genome-wide association studies. And all I really want you to see is that of the signals that are associated with, in this study with obesity defined by body mass index, the overwhelming signal when these locations were grouped by genes that were expressed in different tissues, that the signal was clearly within the central nervous system. It's within the brain. And that's really the key regulator of obesity. In my opinion, is the genetic regulator of appetite, lots of other things as well that I'm going to talk about. But I think that's a really important thing that we're going to come back to. Now, you always see about these twin studies, don't you? And they're quite easy to criticise, and they're very old as well. This is the first of the twin studies I'm going to talk about today. And this was a study of 101 twins. 40 were identical, and 61 were non-identical. And these are children who were studied at age 7. And I don't really like this image, and I don't use it in kind of every presentation, but I thought I would share it with today's audience. I think some of these images are fairly out of date in kind of modern society, but we all know that identical twins are more similar to each other than non-identical twins. We obviously all know that, and that applies to all sorts of characteristics, but it also applies to obesity and to adiposity as well. The more striking data, though, I think, regards the twin studies, is this Swedish twin registry study. And this is now of twins who were studied actually as adults, so not age 7, but studied as adults. And it's self-reported values of body mass index, but with a significant attempt at validation of that self-reported data as well. And it's looking at some twins, so identical and non-identical, who grew up together, so in the same house, same mum and dad, etc. And also some groups of twins who, for whatever reason, were separated and grew up in adopted environments or in foster care and grew up apart. And the average age of separation of twins that grew up apart was less than 3 years old, so separated quite early in their life. And then their body mass index is studied as adults. And what I just want to show you is that in these monozygotic, so exactly the same genetic material twins, the twins that were reared apart, so I don't know the word reared, but grew up separately, the correlation of the body mass index was 0.7. So you can imagine that as their BMI was 70% similar, is a way to perhaps think about that, and then reared together. But those twins that were the dizygotic, so the non-identical twins that were reared together, grew up together, the similarity in body mass index is only 33%. So that really speaks to me about the genetic signature underlying obesity. So these are people growing up with essentially near enough the same, identical twins, but in different environments. One's growing up in, perhaps even in this country or in this city, and yet actually the body mass index more closely matches. Yes, please.
Again, well, I'm a statistician. If I look at the women, I
Yeah.
see different...
Yes, exactly. It's the data is, there's a separation, isn't there? Yeah.
Yeah. But also, I see that for the women, the identical twins, it's exactly the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that is probably a so this is monozygotic twins kind of that grew up apart and obviously grew up together, and there was no difference whatsoever. So I guess one way to look at this is actually the female data is almost even more convincing, because actually here you can see that the only clear difference is where they grew up, and the data is exactly the same. But some of that, of course, will be a feature of the numbers and the statistical size. But I think it's reasonably interesting data. And I think it does show that most of the body mass index is determined, I think, by genes, at least in these kind of studies.
I can
Yes.
give one more thing to add to that. Women have one more thing in common. They definitely have the mitochondrial. They have that. They come
Yes,
from the
mitochondrial
mother.
DNA,
So mitochondrial DNA is identical for women always.
Exactly. So what we're talking about here is where we get we have our kind of chromosomal DNA and our half from mum and half from dad, and our mitochondrial DNA as well. And that's the point you're kind of...
That's just from mum.
Which is all just from mum. Yeah. And that could easily be a potential explainer of some of this, particularly with the role of mitochondria and energy expenditure. So I think that's really interesting and useful point, actually. And this is, again, some data from what we call a systematic review, so grouping together some of the available studies. And this is just data from some of the 9 twin studies. And this shows what happens in terms of heritability, so the genetic influence on heritability on body mass index. And it shows here that across age developing, there's an extremely high, near enough, if we skew the data slightly, around about 75% in these kind of studies looks to be from genetic causes. But okay, well look, why do we always talk about these twin studies from well over 20 years ago, some of them anyway? And how relevant are they to the non-twin population? And you know, these slides always get trotted out, don't they, these kind of twin slides, and I'm sure some of you have seen them before. And I think this is actually a really important study. This is a study that was only published this year, and I think it's actually fundamental in how we classify and think about the causes of obesity. And I'm slightly surprised it didn't get more coverage and traction. It's a study of 2 million genetic changes that was looked at in more than 300,000 people from birth to when they were middle-aged. Okay? And from that 2.1 million common genetic changes, the authors derived what we call a polygenic risk score. So it was a score based on the number of accumulated genes that they thought were relevant to being of higher weight. And I use the word weight because of what I'm going to show you in a second. And the number 1 is you've got a fairly low score, and the number 10 is you've got a high score. Okay, so they were deciles of score. And what you can see at birth, there's not much difference in scores. But by the time you're 18, this is people here, sorry, I keep looking at this side, so I'm sorry about that. This is people over here with a kind of high score, and people on the left with a low score. And look at the separation in weight by age 18, just from a study looking at a genetic score. And actually, when you look at, I'll just flash this up, when you look at data on middle-aged adults, of people at the higher risk and the lower genetic risk, the weight difference here is actually 13 kilograms. That's obviously a significant amount of weight. And I think this study is really important when we think about the genetic causes of obesity. Lots of the previous genome-wide association studies, they only usually explain a very small percentage of variance in body mass index. But I think this study is actually quite crucial to how we think about the genetics of obesity. And obviously we all will perhaps have seen some slides around monogenic causes of obesity. So now I've just shown you about lots of different genes adding together and perhaps contributing to obesity. And now a little bit of just 1 or 2 slides on problems with a single gene, okay, contributing to obesity. And all of these genes are implicated in how the brain responds to various chemicals and regulates appetite. And in the column on the right, that's just it's not a complete list, but that's just a list of some of the genes known to have monogenic changes that can drive obesity. But of course, everybody says when you hear about monogenic obesity, and you may have heard or seen some slides of families perhaps with monogenic leptin deficiency, and then people receive recombinant leptin and have incredible change in body mass index and weight. But these are very rare, and overwhelmingly these are rare conditions. But I am going to come on to perhaps why they might not be quite so rare in just a minute. Well, look, and I'm not going to talk about monogenic obesity today because I think that is something all of itself. But these causes are very rare, and surely people say, well, look, when somebody's got a problem with one gene causing obesity, isn't it very obvious? Okay, and people say that to me, and I used to do clinics in a condition called Bardet-Biedl syndrome and also Alström syndrome, which are syndromic conditions that include obesity. And patients with those conditions have a group of symptoms and signs and findings on examination and results that make it clear enough, at least to me, that that's the diagnosis. But actually, what about people living with obesity who seem just like you and I, and perhaps don't have anything to make it obvious that somebody's got a particularly rare condition or a syndrome or anything like that. And this is a study that I think came out from France, looking at more than 2,500 people with obesity and more than 2,500 control people. And it was looking at mutations in the MC4R receptor, which I just flipped back, is a central receptor to lots of the processes regulating appetite. And what they found, I'll just go straight to the conclusion, very interestingly, was that in the control population, so people without obesity, the prevalence of the mutation was 0.15%, so very, very rare. But in people with obesity, the prevalence of that mutation was 1.7%. That's a very high prevalence of a genetic mutation in an unselected cohort, an unselected group of people with obesity. And what they also showed was that the chance of, if you had that mutation, whether you were not obese or whether you did have obesity, the chance of you having obesity was 60%. So that was the penetrance of the mutation. So there's going to be a lot of people in the world who have this genetic mutation, and there are some drugs being designed to treat people with this particular mutation, and actually bariatric surgery can still apply and be effective in people with an MCR4 receptor mutation. But actually it's a hard thing to diagnose because we don't have access to genetic testing apart from certain fairly rare circumstances. In my own service, it's very difficult to do genetic testing for obesity, and there's lots of arms I have to twist and people I have to convince to get that to happen. So, okay, well, what people say is, you've said genes are really important, but look, your genes aren't changing. Genes aren't changing, are they? But obesity is becoming more common. And I showed you this slide earlier on, didn't I? Some of this is the average BMI in 1975 and 2014. Yes, the prevalence of obesity is increasing, the genes haven't changed in that interval, but the environment has, and I'll also need to talk about that, and also some biology as well. I'm going to talk to you now a little bit about the biological determinants of obesity. And this is to answer, well, look, if the genes are so important and our genes haven't changed, you know, why is prevalence increasing? And that's partly biological, partly environmental. Because this has been a bit death by PowerPoint so far, I'm just going to kind of share some experiences of people I look after. Obviously, there'll be nothing identifiable in any way about some of these kind of relevant conditions. So I'll actually start right to left, because I'm an endocrinologist, so I need to start in the green endocrine box. Cushing's syndrome. So a patient around about 6 months ago, a lady who had lived with obesity for most of her adult life and had type 2 diabetes, but her weight had been stable for many years actually, with no real change. And then in over a period of about 3 months, she put on 20 kilograms of weight in just 3 months. And her HbA1c, her overall measure of diabetes control, had gone from being in target to being significantly elevated. And she was referred to our general diabetes clinic. Please, can you help this lady whose diabetes is control is getting worse, I suppose we could say. But obviously on a kind of detailed conversation around her weight trajectory and what was happening and her diet, it became very clear that there was something else happening. And because of the way her adipose tissue was distributed, she struck me as somebody who may well have this very rare condition that we call Cushing's. And then we obviously did the biochemical testing, and sure enough, she did have Cushing's, and she had a fairly large adrenal tumour of about 4.5 centimetres, which has now been removed, and will now anticipate, it's only been removed fairly recently, we now anticipate seeing significant improvement in her diabetes control and potentially her weight as well. And we've got a number of patients who've had that condition, who've had an experience of quite significant weight gain and then weight loss post-surgery. But it is a very, very rare condition, and we mustn't test for it indiscriminately outside of certain circumstances, and one of that is the change in weight and weight trajectory. If we think as well perhaps about perhaps this box over here, hypothalamic obesity. So part of hypothalamic obesity, and I've told you that appetite is mostly regulated within the brain, Got a few patients at the moment who've had brain tumours called craniopharyngiomas, which directly invade the hypothalamus, the area of the brain responsible for lots of things, but in particular appetite regulation being one. So this is a patient who's had their tumour removed. She's now, two people this applies to, now deficient in various hormones that come from the pituitary gland because that's been damaged and part of it removed as part of this surgery. And these two ladies I'm thinking of have now got profound hyperphagia. So they're really driven to eat. Okay? And they're both working very hard because they know that it's because of the tumour and the surgery and the radiotherapy, and they're working incredibly hard to try and overcome an enormous biological signal. Okay? And it's very, very, very difficult indeed, and they've got other complications that make things tricky. So for example, they're both on steroids, and I'll talk about steroids in a second. So we've now got both of those ladies on a GLP-1 agonist. I won't name which one, because they both have type 2 diabetes as well, so they meet our criteria locally. But we don't know how, I don't know how significantly that will be effective in those two patients. And they may well undergo bariatric surgery. One thing would be interested, the other is less so. But these are just some biological examples of people we meet and look after who perhaps have got something slightly different, driving their obesity. Yep.
Yeah. You say that surgery. Is that any surgery or just surgery on the head?
Where are we looking? Which column?
Third column.
This one, hypothalamic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On the top.
It really means brain surgery.
Brain surgery.
Brain surgery. Yeah. Brain surgery. Yeah.
Just being the devil's advocate for a minute. You started off the talk with the question what obesity is. And now that chart reads adult patient with obesity and a lot of different things below it. Wouldn't it be a valid standpoint to say those are different diseases, a lot of different diseases, and they have just one common effect which manifests in having more weight?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. So that I think if I've heard you correctly, what you're saying is that obesity is several different diseases, in fact, as defined by its different causes. And I couldn't agree with that statement anymore. Okay? And I think that will become clear when we revisit some of the conclusions. Because actually, obesity is clearly multifactorial, as I'm increasingly showing you. And treatments and responses have to be bespoke to the person, but they've also got to be fairly bespoke to the cause as well. And in every other type of medicine, we would identify that therefore as a slightly different disease, a related but perhaps different disease. Yeah, so I think that's a completely fair point. Okay, and there's other things as well. I mentioned steroids just a moment ago. Lots of medications that people are on are clearly very obesogenic. Lots of people in the world need to take steroids, so around about 2% of the adult population in Europe will be prescribed steroids, either inhalers, tablets or creams. Creams less so, but inhalers and tablets have a weight gain effect. And of course insulin. Lots of people with type 2 diabetes, or type 1 diabetes as well, are on insulin. And as we know, as diabetes control changes and the overall control perhaps sometimes gets worse, well, I don't really like that word, but I'm not quite sure what else to say, the dose of insulin often goes up, and that has an effect on people's weight, and then the weight goes up, people become more insulin resistant, and then the insulin goes up, and then the weight goes up. And perhaps some of you in this room might have experienced that kind of biological phenomenon, and it's very difficult to break that cycle. There are some drugs that we try and use, but it's a very difficult cycle once the patient is experiencing that conflict between controlling their diabetes with ever-increasing doses of insulin, appreciating that ever-increasing dose of insulin is also going to have a significant effect on weight as well. But what about the environment and how it interacts with our genetic risk? And this is really to answer the question a little bit, that if genes are so important and our genes haven't changed, why is obesity prevalence increasing? Because of course a few of the things I've told you in the kind of biology section, the rates of some of those conditions is increasing, but overwhelmingly, it's not. So there's clearly something else that's a significant driver. And I think everyone in this room would agree it's the world in which we live and the lives that we sometimes have to live. So the real kind of, I suppose, godfather, academically speaking, of the term obesogenic environment is this academic who's based between Australia and New Zealand, who previously coined the term, I think in the 80s, when he'd been studying the Pima Indian population on a ranch, a reserve, in Arizona, and he'd seen the effect that adopting a so-called Western lifestyle that we all hear about on this kind of indigenous population. And that's really the kind of origin, just for general interest, of the obesogenic environment. One of the things there's a lot of data around now is the availability of takeaways and processed food and out-of-home eating. I'm not sure if I really should have nicked this slide, so if you wouldn't mind not photographing it, that would be great. Because I've cropped this off a website, so I'm not sure of the copyright rules of that site, but it's quite a good site, although it only applies to the UK, unfortunately. But those of you with a general interest might like to have a play with it, because it's very user-friendly, and it's called the Food Environment Assessment Tool. And this is just the number of takeaways in different counties within the United Kingdom. So the darker red areas, the more takeaways. And when we drill in on a kind of smaller level, the blue arrow is our Heart and Hospital, kind of the ASTO Centre of Obesity Management that I mentioned earlier on. And this, in that red box around that blue arrow, that's only really a few streets. Okay? And what you can see here, within the few streets just around where I work, we've got somewhere between 3 and 5 takeaways just across those few streets. And we know from everywhere I live, you live, I'm sure as well, unless you live somewhere very nice and rural, in which case invite me to come and I'd love to come and visit. Everywhere we live, the amount of takeaway food that we're exposed to is constant, isn't it? And I don't know about you guys, but certainly for me, you know, when I'm tired, I've been working hard, etc., and I'm frustrated, it's so easy to go and have a takeaway when everything is just there. And it's very, very difficult to overcome that biological and environmental and genetic drive. This is quite an interesting study looking at takeaway exposure in around about 5,000 adults in the kind of Cambridge area. And what they looked at was the effect that being exposed to takeaways had, whether it was around the home, whether it was near work, whether it was when they were commuting for work, or a combination of all of the above. And what the data showed was that the more exposure you had to takeaways, you had an increased body mass index. I don't think that will surprise perhaps anybody, but I do think it is useful to kind of actually prove some of these things when you might be thinking about implications for policy. So, for example, Birmingham City Council now has a restriction on new takeaway restaurants, and it has actually stopped a few being developed because it has a rule around the number on a particular given area. And I think this is a really nice study, really carefully done by Kevin Hall in America, looking at the effect of ultra-processed against unprocessed food. And it is only a small study, but I do think it speaks to me a lot about the biology of what's going on in response to the food that we're exposed to. And this is a study of 20 adults who were defined as being weight stable. And they were housed in a research unit, so it's not the real world. You know, everybody's asked to come and live, essentially, in a research centre for about a month. Okay, so it doesn't sound like a lot of fun to me. Okay? And they're randomised in a random order to one particular diet or the other diet. Some people will get this diet first, and then that diet. Some people will get that diet first, and then the other diet. Completely kind of random design. And the meals that they're offered are matched for what we call presented calories. So that doesn't mean the calories that people eat, but it's the calories that are available, you know, within that meal. So they're matched for presented calories, what we call the energy density, macronutrients, sugar, salt, and fibre. And the people within this study, sorry, I've cropped that word subject from the paper. The people that were instructed to consume as much or as little as they wanted. So there was no, you've got to finish it all, you've got to only have half. It was here's your meals, eat as much or as little as you want. That was the advice in this kind of carefully chosen design study between a processed diet with a very well-matched unprocessed diet. And the top line shows how much energy was consumed across a day. And in the very processed diet, there's a significant increase in the amount of energy that people consume compared to the unprocessed diet. And the bottom panel shows the body weight change measured in kilograms. So this is only 2 weeks of being told you must always eat this processed food or you must always eat this unprocessed food. Very well designed, very carefully designed by only a very small number of people. And it just shows the kind of food that we are surrounded by constantly, the effect it can have on us. And very interestingly, in the unprocessed diets, so I guess the unprocessed, the kind of healthier perhaps diet, ghrelin, that important hunger hormone, was lower, and PYY, a satiety hormone, was higher. I mean, the study wasn't powered to look at the causes of this difference, it was just to look at energy expenditure. But it shows to me that we're surrounded by a lot of takeaways, and the food that we're surrounded by is clearly obesogenic. Can we modify some of the obesogenic genetic signal that we have? And this is a study looking at physical activity. And it shows here, so that the minor allele, the people who are most genetic risk from this particular genetic change, which I don't need to explain. And you can see that physical activity, which is black and white, is no physical activity. Physical activity, which was self-defined in this study, which is very difficult, had a differentiating effect on body mass index. But look again, because actually by body mass index criteria, the people who had the greatest genetic risk had a body mass index of more than 30, but how much more than 30, at least in this study, seemed to be, at least in part, controlled by physical activity. And there's a number of reasons why it's important to take some of these studies with a slight pinch of salt. So perhaps genetic risk might be, to an extent, modified by physical activity. And some of the data is supported by fairly large systematic reviews with meta-analysis, but I haven't shown that here. And what about the interaction of sedentary behaviours, for example, watching television and exercise? And this is a study of around about 10,000 people, and it's an effect of genetic risk score on changing body mass index. Okay. And what it shows is if you start off, I keep going with this, Madison, can you see that now? If you start off over here, sorry everybody, over on this side here, perhaps not doing much exercise and progress this way to doing more exercise, the effect that the genes had on BMI was perhaps small. Okay. And here, if you watch lots of television compared to watching less of television, and that was clarified by hours per day, but I can't remember the numbers, it looked to have a small modifying effect in that particular study using that particular genetic risk scoring. So here, by the scores that they used here, it looks like there was a potential modifying effect of physical activity and TV watching on body mass index in this study. And in fact, much can be said, and I'll whiz through a couple of slides now in the interest of time, in sugar-sweetened beverages as well. So people with a higher genetic risk seem to be more susceptible to the effect of sugar-sweetened beverages at just one serving a day on markers of obesity. So look, all this genetic risk, people say to me, it's so small, so small. You know, most of the studies, they only explain 1 to 3% of the variance in BMI, and you've just shown that it can be partially modified by exercise and changing sedentary behaviours or exposure to the food environment. So how important is the genetic signal really? And that's not my question, but that's the kind of thing that people are going to say when you start talking about some of that data. And I refer you back to this study once again, which I think is so important, which I think very convincingly shows us that the more genes there is, the more risk. And this is a really powerful study looking at lots of different gene locations in a big number of people. And the people with the most genes, as middle-aged adults, had a 13 kilogram difference between the high and the low score people. So this is a really clear, to me, study showing that there is a major effect, not a statistical effect, not the graph does this type of effect, but a real effect that affects real people by genes in an unselected population. So I think there is a clear genetic basis for obesity risk. And what about the in utero environment? Because people say, of course, well, look, if the genes are so important, don't some people just need to make better choices when they're adults? Okay, so they use the word choices, okay, in quotations. And that's the kind of thing that people say. But how can that be possibly true when I'm about to show you that the effects of things that happen before we're even born have a very significant effect on us as an adult? And I hope some of this is kind of convincing. Now the top panel looks between the difference between women who had only had the one child, so they weren't previously pregnant, is the black bars, and the grey bars is people who women who had previous children as well. So it was nulliparous, so they hadn't been pregnant before, or multiparous, which means they had been pregnant before. Okay? And on the left, it was about the mother's body mass index in early pregnancy, and as was the right. And here we're looking at the percentage body fat in their offspring, importantly studied as adults. So not as children, but studied as adults. And you can see that there looks to be a separation in some of the data that's shown. And underneath those three different colours, that's about what happened to the mother's weight in early pregnancy. So the white bars is the mum didn't gain much weight, and the grey shaded bar is she gained a little bit of weight, and the black bar is she gained more than the recommended amount of weight, because obviously weight gain in pregnancy is a state of health and is normal. Yeah? But these women gained more health weight than would be recommended. And that showed here that the women who gained more weight, their offspring were at increased risk of gaining weight themselves. But you could say to me, well, that's all genetic. The child's got the same genes as the mum, so what do you expect? And I'm going to come on to that, obviously, in a few moments' time. And here, this is looking at mum's pre-pregnancy body mass index on the left, and on the right, what we call her gestational weight gain, so how the weight changed. And this is now studying the change in adults' body mass index between the ages of 17 and the ages of 32. And I think what you can hopefully fairly convincingly show is that there's a big difference, and there's a big change, even when you match it for the genetic signal. And I think that data is fairly clear that what's happening in utero is extremely important, even as adults. And if you don't believe me here, even when we correct for genetic risk, the environment is important as adults as well. Well, will you believe me when I show you data, Scottish data this time, from 40,000 adults with available birth data? And when we look at the classification of the mother based on her weight status as determined within the paper, you will see that there was an increased risk of cardiovascular disease mortality in the adult offspring. And what this classifies, or what the numbers mean, is that when the mother was classified as having obese within this study, there was a 40% increase in the chance of cardiovascular disease mortality in the adult child. So it's very important, and there's lots of studies going on. It's not my area, but there's lots of studies going on thinking about obesity, preconception, but also in pregnancy as well. So I'm just going to try and very quickly link some of these causes together. And I hope I'm still well okay for time, I think, aren't I? Yeah, because there's still a bit more discussions to be had. But trying to link some of the causes together, I think I've shown you that we've got some predisposed individuals, whether that be genetic, or I haven't talked about epigenetics today, but maternal programming, who are living in an obesogenic environment, having adopted a westernised lifestyle. But I guess that term is so old-fashioned now, because that's just life, isn't it, really, to an extent. We're doing less and less home cooking. We've got a significant availability of out-of-home eating, with a high availability of calorie-dense, but also processed food. Actually, just a comment that I didn't mention, that very carefully controlled study before with the processed food versus the unprocessed food study, and that small study, one of the very interesting things I think from that study is the speed at which the processed food was consumed in terms of calories against time compared to the unprocessed food. We eat processed food far more quickly than we eat unprocessed food, which is interesting when we think about biological changes in response to eating and the end of hunger and the beginning of satiety. We're also exposed to food marketing all the time, aren't we? I won't name a particular company, but there are fairly major fizzy drinks companies that seem to sponsor everything, don't they? And we're surrounded by advertising. Endocrine disrupting chemicals, I think, is probably a bit of an emerging field, really. There's some chemicals are involved in stain resistance, and they can have a direct effect on adipogenesis, but I do think that's a bit of an emerging area. And actually, there's a big effect of socioeconomics on obesity that's not consistent between different countries. Okay? So in some countries, you will see that people who live with more poverty live with more obesity. And in other countries, you will see the opposite pattern. But there is, in certain environments, there does look to be a clear socioeconomic factor. Because, of course, particularly when we think about diet, and hopefully you're all aware of the issue with diet, is about, well, what actually can people afford, when we think about diet. Not everybody can, for those people who support low-carb diets, not everybody can afford to necessarily follow that kind of very strict diet regimen. And also, reduce physical activity. And that's partly because of the built environment, IT-based leisure time, transportation, work demands. Perhaps it's to do with safety in our neighbouring streets. Do we feel confident to go outside? Are we safe to go outside? There's a huge amount of implications. And, I'm not an expert in the obesogenic environment. I'm coming at this from more of a biological angle, but I'm just trying to kind of give you some of the key causes. One of the things I do want to be really clear about is that I'm going to talk about some of the consequences of obesity in just a second. Obesity isn't merely a risk factor for metabolic disorders. It's not a condition, it's a disease in its own right. And I think we've got to be really consistent as a community that it's a disease in its own right, not a condition, not a disorder, and not a risk factor. And I think it's important, and some of you might disagree, and that's fine, but I do think we have to be fundamentally on message about this kind of key area.
Sorry, John, actually, I'm interrupting you in a key message, but on the previous slide, have you observed synergistic effects between the different causes?
Yeah. So there's a fair bit of data around that, because obviously when we think about choice, again, lots of choice is actually genetically mediated. Behaviour is largely genetically driven. So there's a fair bit of data about perhaps the food we consume or the activity we do and how it ties into genetics. Okay. So all of these signals interlink, and that's why your point is key, that obesity is perhaps best classified as not one disease, but very many diseases, perhaps at the end defined by increased adiposity. But of course, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the consequences of obesity, and I've shown this slide before, and this is just a trip back to BMI data. But remember we spoke about the Edmonton obesity staging system earlier on. Does that project? Can you see that? Can you see the words?
It's a bit small.
A bit small, just about, yeah. So this is from, because remember earlier on I showed those graphs, and the BMIs all look the same with all those different people, but in the Edmonton obesity staging system there were differences. And this really speaks to me that actually what the individual is experiencing is crucial in their assessment. And you'll notice when you look at some of the work examples in the grey boxes, I'll give you a minute to look at them, that actually body mass index doesn't really track. Okay? So look at that green body mass index, from green stage 1 up there. This is an example of someone with a 38-year-old lady with body mass index of 59, borderline hypertension, mild lower back pain, knee pain, and that patient has stage 1 obesity, okay, by this letter of this law. Okay? You'll here see here stage 2. This is now a man who's got a body mass index of 36, obviously a lot lower than, that's lower than 59, but he's got primary hypertension and obstructive sleep apnea. Okay? So, and that's more informative than saying this person has a BMI of this or this person has a BMI of that. And we know actually that the people most least at risk are those with a score of 0, but actually that's not very common, and I've shown you this separation before already. We've had lots of questions, and I am keen to talk a little bit about bariatric surgery data. and we are going to have some room for some more questions. So I'm going to deliberately whiz through a couple of slides, but I'm going to briefly mention cancer. I'm going to briefly mention Cancer Research UK. And this is just a graphic that I won't go through that can link perhaps how obesity might be implicated in certain cancers. They recently led a very stigmatising campaign. Some of you will have seen it. The word obesity was put onto cigarette packets and various other elements of the campaign as well. And it was, in my opinion, unhelpful, and it was stigmatising. But what I worry about at a kind of people level is the risk of delayed presentation because of stigma, particularly around cancer. I'm going to name a particular cancer I worry about in a second. And the risk of misdiagnosis. I hope no one here has heard this, but people are often told who live with obesity that it's all your weight. It's all your weight that's causing this, that's causing these symptoms, that's causing your bad knee, that's causing your whatever it might be, that's somehow causing your postmenopausal vaginal bleeding. I'm not quite sure how weight can do that. And that's really not appropriate, and that is a major, major concern. And this is a registry database of kind of 5 million or so people looking at the risk of 22 cancers and the effect on BMI. And it is important to know that increased BMI was associated with increased risk of cancer in 17 of the 22 cancers studied. And in particular, one of the clear signals that came out was the increased risk of uterine cancer. Now, uterine cancer is comparatively rare, thank goodness. But the effect of a 5 kilogram per metre squared increase in body mass index has a 60% increase risk on somebody's chance of having uterine cancer. And lots of people aren't able or don't feel confident to access healthcare. And I just wanted to reiterate that we must think about obesity as a disease. The answer is yes. It more than meets the AMA criteria for a disease because it has an impairment of function, and there can be characteristic signs and symptoms, and there is significant harm and morbidity. And lots of countries have recognised obesity as a disease, which is fantastic, but there's a long way to go. And actually, Portugal was one of the kind of early initiators in recognising. This was the slide with some text in Portuguese I mentioned in the lift yesterday. And look, this is childhood obesity surveillance data, and in Portugal at least there looks to be a reduction in the prevalence of overweight and obesity within children, which is a huge achievement. And it's not caused by just saying obesity is a disease, obviously. It's caused by so many of the policies that happen in Portugal, and perhaps we'll hear about some of them later. But part of that, and part of changing the dialogue and the dynamic, is saying that obesity is a disease, in my opinion. And that's why it's important, okay? We have to improve our collaboration, government, obesity professionals, healthcare services, authorities, the food industry, and of course people with obesity has to be central to that. And that's why I think ECPO is so good, and I actually think it's a great organisation that should be a blueprint for other conditions and diseases that I also kind of work in. And external agents that can be modified are relevant because, of course, we do have to address the environment that we live in. We can't just treat people, although we must treat people. We also have to treat the environment as well. Both things need to happen. And approaching and addressing stigma is crucial. It has to be both. And we must improve our services. And I am going to have to whiz through a couple of things. Because you've asked me so many questions, and I thought, well, look, just in case I don't get any questions, I better make a kind of death by PowerPoint presentation. But I just want to say that the chance of achieving a normal body mass index less than 25 in people with obesity is very, very low in big numbers. This is registry data. This isn't people who are trying to do this necessarily, but it's people within this cohort who do it. It's extremely difficult, and weight gain is extremely common. And I will show this slide, which is important. This is an analysis of lots of different dietary studies. The dark blue is what happened after the diet, and the light blue is what happened after the follow-up period. And of course, you can see that there's significant weight regain. Hunger increases in response to weight loss. Some of us might have experienced that. And that's largely generated and changed not by fasting hormones, but hormones that change after we eat. And even after weight loss, those hormonal changes persist, perhaps even after we've regained the weight. And that's why you'll often see, or you may have experienced, that some people who are able to lose weight but regain it actually then regain more than their lost weight. And that's entirely biologically driven, but I haven't got time to go into that in great detail, but I'm happy to talk about it later. Of course, when I practice this presentation many times in a closed room, it takes like an hour, doesn't it? Perhaps that's me speaking too quickly. I do want to just touch on bariatric surgery, if I can have perhaps two or 3 minutes. Lots of you will have heard of, and this is their term, it's a historical term, the Swedish obese subjects trial. Obviously we don't use that kind of language anymore, but it's as was, okay, and that's the name of the studies. It's multiple studies, it's about 100 research papers that have come from this, and it really is the fundamental basis to everything we know about bariatric surgery, although there are a few criticisms of this study. So it wasn't a randomised control study because the ethics board wouldn't let the authors randomise, but it was a matched study, so that they did as best as they could. And I guess lots of you will have seen some of this data, and this is just initially just weight loss data, and it just to show you that actually bariatric surgery can be effective for a very long time indeed. Some of this, I guess, is becoming increasingly historical now because the change in the numbers of different types of operations that we now do. So I think you'll hopefully now know that worldwide gastric sleeve is the most common type of bariatric surgery. Slide on that in a second. And this is just the data around survival on the left and diabetes remission, just to show you that bariatric surgery is clearly an effective treatment. But it's not for everybody. It can't be for everybody. You know, it is very difficult. There can be complications and there can be consequences. Some of you will ask me what's the best time for bariatric surgery for me. Okay? So people ask that question. Officially, I don't have an answer for that officially. The bi-band sleeve study that Birmingham is a centre for has now finished recruiting. That's a randomised controlled study of laparoscopically adjusted gastric band, gastric sleeve and Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, designed to answer some of these questions. But in the data that we do have comparing sleeve and Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, there doesn't look to be a clear difference in percentage weight loss. And that's been echoed across 2 or 3 fairly well-controlled, admittedly quite small studies. And just before I skip through to my kind of final conclusion, is there are lasting benefits, of course there are, to weight loss surgery. And I think quality of life, which is quite a hard thing to put on a graph, can be a kind of a key part of that, as is obviously mortality and cardiovascular risk. But there actually can be significant complications and consequences of bariatric surgery and risks. So for example, there are risks of long bone fracture, risk of depression, and risk of completed suicide, as well as complications of the operation of the gastric anatomy. So it shouldn't be seen as a simple process, and it's extremely complicated living with bariatric surgery, as some of you I'm sure will know, and as lots of my patients tell me, as I see all the time. I've got to have just a word on stigma as I finish. Okay? And 80% of people, this is the UK survey, the Obesity All Parliamentary Parliament Group, I think some people in this room contributed to that. 80% of people with obesity report having been criticised, stigmatised or abused as a direct result of their obesity. I'll just let that kind of hang in the room for a second. A much bigger study, worldwide study with the support of Novo Nordisk, Action.io, 5 continents, lots and lots of people, has looked into this a bit further. And there's actually big discrepancies between what people living with obesity think and what healthcare practitioners think, and you can have to digest that kind of in your own time, because I've very much run out of time. I'm just going to end on this, because I'll just come back to uterine cancer again, and this is a qualitative study looking at experiences of people who had obesity, obviously that's their words on that title, not mine, and endometrial cancer. And there was a comment when this person initially went to be assessed, when I was hemorrhaging, it was hard to examine me because I was so big. You have to understand, being an obese woman, you don't want to get up on that table. You don't want anybody to see you with your clothes off. I think that's quite a powerful way to end the talk. Because really this is all about prevention and treatment, and a big part of treatment is access to care, and a big part of that, I think, is addressing stigma as well. So these are just the same conclusions that I started with. So I'll let them hang up. So thanks very much indeed. I'm sorry if I've talked too much, but it's because you will ask me such good questions and many things so much. So thank you very much indeed.
questions.
And ask me questions at any
So,
point. I'm here all day because I'm here to learn.
And I think we have you for dinner as well.
Yeah.
So we can sidle up beside him. But what I wanted to do was, I'm just going to open Mentimeter because I know we will have a lot of questions. I think as well, the importance of this session is that a lot of the time as patients, we may not understand the complete science, and it may not have been explained in the way in which we would understand it. Some people are quite new representatives. Some people have been around for quite a long time and have listened to the likes of John and Ad do a lot of these talks. So what I want to do is throw up the code for Mentimeter. So effectively, this is your code. If anybody wants to ask a question, we can take a few questions now, and we can keep the rest of the questions and make sure that John has time to have a look at them and get back to us, because I think it's really, really important that we all understand. So the code is 208654. 208654. So if you want to enter the code, and the questions will come up on screen. And while you're doing that, I actually have a question for John. And I think it's a really important one that we probably at the last couple of years are starting to dot around really. And patients who have had surgery, or patients who may not have had bariatric surgery, who have lost a lot of weight and then coming back and relapsing, regaining. And people saying, well, you know, eat less, move more. Has everybody got the code? Yeah? Yeah.
You're asking me for a code?
Click
Yeah.
back.
Go to the back arrow.
If you click the back arrow, it will ask you for the code. And the code is also up here. So a lot of people, they will regain weight. So I'll give you a perfect example of myself, 15 years post-bariatric surgery, room Y, and I'm half the weight I lost, I've regained. And I know there's a lot of studies such as, like back in 2009, there was a study that showed that the average person who has had a significant amount of weight loss needs to do 3 times the amount of physical activity than the average person. And I don't think that kind of gets out. But when we talk about regain, and we also talk about set point, Arya Sharma does a really good explanation. And if you give a bit of the idea around the set point and the regain.
So no problem. So as we lose weight from any intervention, including bariatric surgery, our energy expenditure changes. Okay. So as we lose weight, we actually burn less energy. So that's the explanation, but only to a small fraction, is because we have a lower energy expenditure component. Okay. There's been lots of studies that I would have shown you, haven't I talked too much about that, and that's fairly well established. Okay. But when we talk about defending the set point, energy expenditure changes are only part of the story. Part of this is hormonal changes as well. Okay. So bariatric surgery less so, but certainly pharmacotherapy and lifestyle intervention studies. I mentioned very briefly that the hunger hormones go up with weight loss, so ghrelin goes up with weight loss of a non-bariatric surgery origin, and some of the satiety hormones, for example, PYY will go down, but obviously leptin falls as well, because as we lose adipose tissue, some of you in the room will know that leptin is a very important signal that comes directly from the adipose cells themselves. And as we lose that signal, and that's a key satiety signal, as we lose that signal, that has a direct effect on our brain regulation of appetite. And that's not willpower, that's biology actually. And one of the things that happens a bit more in continental Europe, in particular, I don't know if there's anyone here from Austria, and I think from Switzerland as well, actually. I see a couple of Swiss flags there. Some centres in Europe do a lot more revisional surgery than we do. And what I mean by revisional surgery is after somebody's had an initial bariatric surgery, they'll then have subsequent surgery, usually to change what we call limb lengths, that can have an additive if waist loss effect, or called revisional surgery. We do so little revisional surgery in parts of Europe like the UK, and I suspect the Ireland as well, but some people might tell me differently, because we can't get the funding for revisional surgery. And the other thing that there's data for is the use of GLP-1 analogues post-bariatric surgery for patients who are experiencing regain. And again, that is something that we very much struggle with. And we do see this, you know, whatever the weight loss intervention, lifestyle, drug, or surgery, you know, we will always see an excellent initial weight loss for those people who are able to have that intervention, and then a kind of period of regain, and that's all biology. But our response to that is so poor, and that's why we have to recognise that obesity is chronic and relapsing. We don't just do something, and you were saying earlier on, we can't just do something, and, oh, thanks very much, you know, nice to meet you, bye-bye. Because that works for some people, okay, very nicely, fantastic, okay, all the best to those people. But it doesn't work for a lot of people. Our services have to be designed so that they can be accessed by people without jumping through lots of hoops. That's not the system I work in. We've got a load of hoops. Okay? We are trying to change that, but it's very, very difficult. But I do think that recognising obesity disease and access is different.
I like this question because I was actually probably about 5 years out before I started to regain weight, and I'm 15 years out. So BMI was 55, bariatric surgery, 3 years later, 20. Do you still have the disease, or has it gone into remission?
Yeah, this is a fascinating question that some of us debate quite a lot, actually. My own personal take, when we think about the definition of obesity, I suspect if this person who has now got a BMI of 20, I suspect this person doesn't have significant adiposity, and I suspect that their risk of, or virtually the direct function change or impact of their obesity, I suspect has probably changed in terms of perhaps maybe some breathlessness or musculoskeletal problems, and also, of course, this person's cardiovascular risk and long-term risk of lots of conditions has obviously reduced very markedly. So I would say at the moment that this person doesn't have obesity, actually, because I think part of saying that obesity is a condition that's chronic and relapse, we have to think of obesity as a disease that can be treated effectively and cured. If something can relapse, then it perhaps has to be able to be at least transiently, temporarily put into, cure is not a good word, remission is a better word. Remission is a better word. Yeah.
Sorry, may I? Very briefly.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I'd like to come back to.
I want to get you on the mic so we can get you on video, if that's
Oh
okay.
gosh,
So
yeah.
we can record it. Okay.
Okay, so I'd like to come back to the question, comment that I made during the presentation, and also your comments just now. Excellent presentation. But again, when we look at the definition of chronic disease, certainly within the European policy context, it basically means that it never goes away. And you may be having minimal symptoms, you may be having the particular disease under control, but it's still there. And so I personally, so none of the hats that I will be wearing, but I personally really struggle then with the comment that you just made in terms of if your BMI happens to be a particular level, that...
Well, I expanded on BMI, didn't I? I talked about adiposity and function and consequence.
Not just that. To say, let's just say you're within a normal weight, that automatically you're no longer there. Because actually, when you start asking patients, and I do sit on a personal level on various patient preferences, projects, where we start looking at things like that as well. And when you ask the patients across different chronic diseases, what they will talk about, not just quality of life, but the psychological and mental health elements of actually having to sustainably manage their disease. So even if it's hidden at any given point in time, like a lot of people in this room, doesn't mean to say it's not there, doesn't mean to say that they are actually managing in different ways, which may be physical, which may be psychological, which may be out and out mental health as well. So I just wanted to say that because I was really struggling on a personal level then.
I agree with you, having heard your comment. Of course, anyone who's had bariatric surgery who's now then entered into that different situation by whatever the measure, there is still an ongoing effect of treatment, isn't there? So it's a treated perhaps a better way to look at it is it's an ongoing, you're not taking a tablet every day, but you've still got an effect of a biological treatment every day. So it's an ongoing treatment for a disease that's controlling things at the moment. I think perhaps there's a way to look at it. Maybe you might agree with that, I don't know. And that can also apply to various diseases as well. But obviously, things may change, they may not, we don't know. But it's an ongoing, rather than taking a tablet every day to control a disease, and there are things that are far more important than weight-related outcomes, and we didn't talk today about non-scale goals because I didn't have any time, but my personal belief is that mental health is one of, if not the most important aspect, particularly around the kind of perioperative kind of period, but there was no kind of time for the kind of important and nuanced areas of that. So, this question I have a very clear answer to, that's very easy to say but very hard to deliver. Should skin removal be accepted as part 2 if you get gastric surgery? And look, I'll tell you what my opinion is, but at the moment it doesn't change anything. My opinion is yes, obviously. What people's experiences in their own different countries? Have people managed to, don't feel you need to tell me about your own perhaps personal experience, but perhaps on a kind of organisational level within the countries you're from, are people able to get excess skin surgery removed without pain?
Okay, so it does vary from country to country. Obviously we have a lot of best practice in certain countries. I know the likes of Ireland particularly. I think myself, there's a few from the UK as well that would hands up say, do you know what, it's not a done deal, unfortunately. Paul is probably a good person to answer. We're going to go to break in about 2 or 3 minutes, so can we wrap up on this and then come back afterwards? But we do have you for today, so we will hog you.
So in terms of when I went for my WLS in 2016, I was pretty much told straight away that the odds of me getting skin removal surgery on the NHS was literally none. They said that you've got to get yourself down to under a BMI of 25, you've got to maintain your weight for 2 years, and even then they'll only consider helping. So I've been very fortunate in the fact that I found a company that helped me. But in terms of the NHS help, it's even worse than the postcode lottery for WLS in the first place. It is literally 1 in thousands that get help.
Yeah, couldn't agree more, Paul. And as I said to you kind of when we spoke about this really important area yesterday, I've got a couple of people recently who had initially been interested in weight loss surgery and had done very well in our Tier 3 programme and would have been all lined up and ready to go. They would have jumped through our hoops that exist within the system I work in very, very well. But their great fear was the effect of excess skin. And when they asked me that specific question, will I be able to definitely have skin surgery on the NHS afterwards, I was duty bound to tell them the truth, and the whole truth and nothing but the truth. And no long conversation about the metabolic advantage or anything like that would dissuade these two people, or because that was what they were greatly concerned about. And that's kind of a failing of the system that I work in currently, and that lots of us have experienced, I suspect.
We're about to go to the break with Carlos issues.
I want to answer you for that question you put, if someone needs to pay to the surgery to remove skin. In Portugal, this is part of the national package for the treatment of surgical treatment of obesity. So we have the preparation, the surgery, the follow-up, and the surgery for remove skin. And we don't need to pay nothing.
I think as well that goes to show that Portugal, as we've seen as well in the graphs, are leading the way along with France in various strides, and this is why we actually have the ECPO, so that we can all learn from best practice and we can all get to that level. This is the whole reason that we are all here together. So thank you, John. Thank you, everybody. Big round of applause. Thank you so much.